All in favor by the sign of aye. Opposers, nay. Thank you very much. Madam Clerk, ordinance on first reading, that has already been entered into the record. So, with that being said, we will move on to resolutions. 7A, please.
A resolution declaring surplus of an abandoned 10-foot sliver of property located at 1134 East 14th Street, identified as a portion of tax map number 146PE008, and to quit claim the city's interest in the sliver to the property owner of record.
Seeing no questions, let's move on to B, please.
A resolution authorizing the Chief Information Officer to renew the city's existing blanket agreement with Kershaw Technology Corp. To purchase a sell of public service platforms, including Treasury Finance, Economic and Community Development, and Public Works Services for the contract year beginning May 24, 2019 through May 23, 2020, for an annual cost not to exceed $234,214.63.
Thank you. Let's move on to
Mr. Chair.
Councilman Smith.
Thank you, sir.
Yes.
We asked earlier about clarification on this item being added to the agenda on short notice and what the reason was. And more, I can't remember. Was this one of the ones you were able to answer, or were you still looking for information on this one? This is the IT.
Yes, sir. On the Acela contract, this is a contract that we had. I did give you this information at 1:30.
Okay, I just want to make sure that we had it
But
out.
yes, so double checking that. It is a contract that we know was set to expire on May 24th. We were having lots of discussion with the company to ensure that we were getting the product that we wanted and that we were getting invoiced at the right time. We were having some invoicing discussions with the company. And so we continued to work through those concerns with the company, and we are at a point that we feel comfortable continuing in that contract. But we're sorry that it took a little bit longer to negotiate, but we are at a point where that we're ready to move forward.
And just out of curiosity, was this item on the look-ahead, on the future consideration?
I'm not sure.
Ever?
I'm not sure. Let me
All right.
check with my colleagues. Do you know?
It was? Okay.
Yes,
I
it
just want
was.
to make sure. I thought I saw it, and then it
Thank
showed
you.
up short like this. I wanted to make sure that it was clear why it was coming up. It was because of that. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Okay, let's move on to item C, please.
A resolution to confirm the mayor's appointment of Otis L. Moore to the Passenger Vehicle for Hire Board.
D, please.
A resolution confirming and approving the appointment of Warren E. Logan Jr. as a member of the Electric Power Board of Chattanooga from the effective date hereof until April 15, 2024, and thereafter until a successor is appointed and qualified.
Thank you. E, please.
A resolution confirming and approving the appointment of Marcus Shaw as a member of the Electric Power Board of Chattanooga from the effective date hereof until April 15, 2023, and thereafter until a successor is appointed and qualified.
Okay. Item F has been read into the record as of last week. So now we'll move on to item number G, please.
A resolution authorizing the city purchasing director to enter into an agreement with Omnia Partners Corporate Purchasing Organization formed by merging the formerly separate cooperatives, the Cooperative Purchasing Network, National Intergovernmental Purchasing Alliance, and U.S. Communities.
Seeing no questions, we'll end that portion of the meeting. We have no departmental report. So now we will move on to Chairman Ledford, Planning and Zoning Committee.
Thank you, Chairman. Welcome, good afternoon, everyone. We've waited a long time, thank you for that very much, to get to our next planning and zoning meeting. But that now starts with John Bridger.
Yes, sir. Good afternoon. We have a number of cases, so I'll start off with the first one. This is located on the 3500 block of 7th Avenue in the East Lake community. The request is to rezone from R1 residential zone to C2 convenience commercial zone to allow for the construction of an auto repair shop. Again, you see the property outlined in yellow there. Zoom in a little close. There is a mix of uses in the area. You do have an existing auto-related facility to the north. You've got a manufacturing facility across the street to the east. But the rest of the block south of here is residential as well as behind. Here you see some pictures looking into the site. There is a WPA ditch, which you'll see in a site plan here in a minute, that runs through the northern portion of the site. It's currently vacant, but again, bordered by a repair shop to the south and some single-family resident to the north and some a single-family residential to the south. Here you look at the zoning map. Currently, the remainder of this block is, you get that one portion on the north that's zoned M1, and then you have 4 parcels on the south that are zoned R1 as well as behind. And you do have M1 zoning across the street to the west, or to the east. There has been no recent zoning history on this site. This property was downzoned to R1 as part of a rezoning study following the adoption of the Rossville Boulevard Community Plan in 2004. Here is the site plan showing the proposed use of the site. They positioned the repair shop to the southern portion of the property. That's because of that WPA ditch. You see is that wide brown line running through the northern, which is on the right-hand side of the screen, northern portion of the site. There will need to be a stormwater buffer, which they've indicated there on the site plan, to comply with the stormwater requirements. And so they're trying to do basically a 2-bay auto service facility at this location. And they are showing a buffer also to the south. Looks like a 10-foot wide buffer to abut the adjoining R1 use. The adopted Rossville Boulevard land use plan recommends single-family residential for this site. So staff, in looking at this, we tend to take a careful in not making decisions without there being some kind of a public comment period, any changes as it relates to the land use plan recommendations. We also looked at knowing that it's when you make a zoning change for a property, it could have implications for properties further to the south. And that's the reason for staff's recommendation to deny, not knowing what again, having not updated this plan recently, we would rather have the form of the planning commission process and the city council rezoning process if there's going to be something that's going to be different than the plan recommendation. So staff recommended to deny. At planning commission, there was no opposition to this request. So after planning commission heard from staff's recommendation, the comments from the applicant, they recommended to approve. I guess there might be some conditions, so I don't know if Councilman Oglesby has any updates in that regard.
Henderson.
No. That's what
Go ahead. You are.
Mr. Chairman, it's not my intention to wrong council. I think that District 1
One
is
is 7.
changed to 7.
Yeah.
which was my reason for.
Yes, sir. Got it. Yeah.
So that should be District 7.
Got it.
Okay.
Make a note.
John, are you finished with that case? I'll
Yes,
go to
sir.
Councilman Oglesby if he's ready. Chairman, you ready?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm gonna be talking with my wife further about.
Okay, so we shouldn't expect some changes or additions?
Yes.
Very good. I have no other lights on this case, so we will move on to B, please.
Sure. This is in the Tremont Street, North Chattanooga area. Request to rezone a property from R1 residential and ERM3 residential unit to ERM3 and ERA2. Those are the form-based code districts to accommodate a attached residential development. I think it's important to note on this site, there's another related case for a street closure. Just looking at this map, there's an existing right-of-way, which you can kind of see runs almost north-south or perpendicular along this image slide. That is also part of the request to close and abandon as part of this request to accommodate the development. So there's really 2 different requests. The abandonment is not on the council agenda currently because we're waiting the pending outcome of this rezoning request first. So just note that in order to accommodate the proposed development, they would need to abandon the street. Again, this is a zoning map showing how the property is currently zoned. As you can see, you have ERM3 for a portion of the site. That's what's already been, had what we call the big dig, or the big cut facing Tremont Street. That's the ERM3 portion. The ERA2 portion is fronting on Tucker Street. Here, this shows again what was approved prior when the proposal was presented in 2018. The site plan indicated 6 units fronting Tucker Street and 6 units on Tremont Street. With, you can see here showing retaining the kind of shared vehicular access point along that right of way. Just as a reminder what the zones allow, in ERA you can do up to 4 units per lot, provided that lot has a minimum square footage of 5,000 square feet. And that's where I've got the number of 8 units by right, because based on the total lot area, technically you could divide that into 2 lots, each taking 4 units on the Tucker Street side. The lower portion, zone ERM3, allows, actually, you can do over 5 units per lot. There's really not a density cap. You just have to meet your height maximums and setbacks. Again, here's showing the site plan. What they're proposing to do would be to construct a total of 12 units fronting Tucker Street and 8 or 9 units on Tremont Street, using one point of access off of Tremont Street with parking to the rear in both cases. As you can see in this outline, to accommodate that development proposal, you would need to close and abandon the right-of-way that's running between Tremont Street and Tucker Street. Another important note, I think with the initial proposal indicated by the applicant in consultation, and also based on some conversations with city staff, was maintaining a pedestrian access point going from Tucker Street to Tremont Street through kind of like a sidewalk that had some grade changes to it. Again, here's another image of that same development plan. The adopted North Shore plan recommends urban single-family residential in Tucker, so you can have small lot residential but not multi-unit. And then on the lower portion on Tremont Street recommends medium to high density residential for Tremont. So there's important that there's 2 different recommendations in terms of policy for each of those streets. I think it was important from staff's perspective, you know, while the North Shore plan recommended lower intensity residential on the Tucker Street, it was already zoned R3. So I think that was a big factor in staff's recommendation to approve the ERM3 addition, noting that with the shorter setbacks, it helps to minimize additional grading by putting the buildings closer to the street. So staff recommended to approve, but with some conditions. Parking to be located to the rear, that a stamp drawing provided by a licensed geotech engineer shall be approved as part of the construction process, and maintaining some kind of a publicly accessible pedestrian path between Tucker and Tremont Streets. At Planning Commission, there was opposition. A lot of the concerns had to do with wanting, you know, the narrowness of Tucker Street, concerns about adequate safety access and managing traffic going to and from Tucker Street, as well as wanting to have better sidewalk facilities in terms of how folks would use that property or use that street along the property. So Planning Commission, after hearing from staff's recommendation and the public comments and concerns, recommended approve, basically concurred with staff's recommendation to approve of those 3 conditions. So that I'll turn it over to council if you got any questions.
I was waiting for that light. Councilman Mitchell.
Okay, can you go back to the original, what it is currently zoned? Okay, so we've got an ERA2, which is residential attached 2-story on Tucker.
Yes, sir.
And we've got a existing, well, you know, what is the R4 there? What is that?
That's multi-unit. That's that upper portion. Oh, the lower left. I see what you're saying. Actually, it's R3. That upper, the brown you see in the upper above the ERM3, that's R3.
Okay, so it's R3. Okay, I got you. So in essence,
This might be a better map. Let me go back to that one. That's probably a better map.
okay, okay. So apartments could be built in ERA2?
In terms of attached units, yes. You can do up to 4 units per structure.
Per structure, okay. And if the ERM3, what can you do?
You can do over 5 units per structure, provided you have the minimum square footage of, go back here, of 7,500 square feet, which that does. So as long as you meet your setbacks. Now, there is a, remember that protected zone from R1, where it's if you're within 30 feet, you can't be more than 2 stories. So there are limits in terms of how tall you can go in the setback, so that will end up constraining the number of units as well as parking. But there is not a density maximum in ERM3. It's really constrained by the site.
Okay. All right, and I see on the agenda, the alley closure is not on it, but I'm just here to tell you that I'm not going to be for that alley closure, because I think it's just it was maybe a good idea to start with, but it also is the potential of increasing density. And if one thing I've learned about North Chattanooga, we can get it in there, pack it in there a little bit, but people are getting very, very, very tired of seeing something to scale of something like on Tucker that's 12 units when he started it was 6, but now he's adding on. So I guess the question would be, with his existing zone, he could only do 8 units on Tucker,
Max,
max?
yes.
And how many units could he do, not adding property, because I know that he's actually worked with some of the
Right.
neighbors to try to add some property, but what's the maximum he could do?
I mean, technically, depending on how small you make the units.
Yeah,
I mean, you could do, I know I'm throwing numbers out, but
Can
you
you
could
do
do
10?
15. If you get, well, here's a question. It's constrained by parking.
okay.
So assuming you got to provide parking for each unit, so that's going to limit based on how much space you have on site. Right now, he's showing 6. So could you squeeze maybe another unit on there? Possibly. But it's going to be strained on how much site area you have for parking, as well as, again, the constraints on how tall you can go and how close you can go to the property line. So
Right.
this is probably a good indication of the range of how many units you get with that as currently zoned.
I know you haven't done this calculation, but I'm going to ask it to you anyway. If steep slopes was in place, how many units could he put on this property?
Well, as you know, it depends on what which direction we go.
Yes.
One of the things that we are looking at, because it really are, what we've learned through I'm shifting gears a little bit, but what I think we've learned so far in our review and analysis, that in looking at protecting steep slopes of floodplains, it's really more of a performance-driven question. And what I mean by that is how much of the area you're grading. That's where the problems are, is when you have a large area that's graded or disturbed. Density, depending on how you design it, I mean, because as you know, apartments are getting smaller units. I tend to think of zoning as standing on its own merits in terms of the character, right? Because R3 has a certain character to it, RM3, you know what I'm saying, in terms of the type of development, whereas the lay of the land is another factor, right? And so, in thinking about how many units, it really comes down to what your engineer can design and working around the constraints of how much you grade. Does that make sense? So if you do a high-quality site design, you might get more units and still meet the intent of protecting steep slopes by minimizing the grading and positioning most of your units away. Does that make so if somebody got creative, you know, another, of course, it costs a lot of money. You could go down, which we've seen some sites do, to get their parking going underneath the buildings to make it work. But it would certainly reduce the amount of site disturbance to accommodate the development. I hope that helps.
Yeah, it's fine. So I guess my biggest question is what does this particular developer gain by us approving this zoning change?
It basically gets, going back to this proposed site plan, gets 3 more units on Tremont Street, and since it showed, how many on the fire when it showed? I think it was 6. So it's getting 12 instead of 6 on Tucker and getting 3 more units on Tremont Street.
So there's 9 more units?
Yes, sir.
By approving this zoning change?
Yes.
Okay. Won't take up anybody else's time. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thanks.
Councilman Mitchell, and I have no other lights, John, so we're going to move on to C.
All right. Okay, this is out in Highway 58 area. A request to rezone a site from R1 and R2 residential zones to R4 special zone, trying to consolidate all into one zoned property. It does have multiple zones on it currently. Let me go ahead and jump to the zoning map. As you can see here, one portion of a tract is already zoned R4. That was rezoned, look at my notes here, back in 1990 to accommodate a office development. But there are some remaining parcels. If you see the white around the R4, those are all, again, zoned R1, and they're wanting to consolidate that all into one development area that's zoned R4. Again, give me some locational references. If you're familiar with Champion Road intersection, it's just to the north of this property. There's a church, Mount Calvary Church, that's to the, also immediately to this north of this site. There is a subdivision to the south, Lantana Lane. There's also some large tracts of land that are undeveloped around this property. Here again, you can see some visuals of the church on the upper right. You can see there's also a commercial strip center in front of the office building. And then you see, again, that section of Highway 58 at this location. As I mentioned, there's a mix of zones in this area, R4, C5, R2, and A1. Here is a site plan. We did not get a site plan showing a specific site concept. There was a note on the plan about maybe targeting this for upscale multi-story apartment use. So again, we didn't know no specific site plan as relates to how this would be built out and how adjacent areas would be protected, but an potential intended use for multifamily development. The area is covered by the Highway 58 Community Plan adopted in 2002, and it recommends low-density residential for this area, which is described as single-family detached residential dwellings up to 4 units per acre. Staff found that the request was not compatible with the recommendations of the Highway 58 Community Plan, and really does not comply with our site plan policy in terms of knowing what they're planning to do with the site, so we recommend to deny. I will say on a go-forward basis, we probably should not have taken this request because we usually would require a site plan. I think this one got under our review, but nonetheless, we recommend to deny the request. There was opposition at Planning Commission. There's a little bit of a property owner dispute, and we have not heard any updates. A adjacent property owner presented concerns. They felt like the applicant had a boundary line that was not appropriately reflected, and they had concerns about them potentially rezoning their property without adequate notification. We did not have any other factual information like presented by an attorney or somebody with an engineering background to substantiate that claim. We just know that there's been some kind of a personal dispute between the two parties. So at that point, that was a private matter. We didn't have enough information to presume that the applicant was not presenting information accurately. Nonetheless, Planning Commission did recommend to deny the request, concurring with staff's recommendation. So it has a recommendation to deny from both staff and Planning Commission.
Thank you, John. Councilman Smith, I do have one other light. Councilman Gilbert, what was your pleasure, sir? Very good.
Well, this is not my district, it's Councilman Smith's district, but it's close to mine. And I know in your district, Councilman Smith, I know the Ware Heights, there's a big community that's been there for years, close to this. And I'm assuming that, I don't know if they know about it or not, because they've probably been down there complaining if they did. And I'm glad that, my opinion, that you did deny it. I don't know how Councilman Smith feels about it, but it's, he didn't give us a site plan at all.
Basically, this is what we got.
So he's just trying to go out the blind, trying to do something without letting us know what he's doing, basically.
I'll let, yeah. That's
I'd
what it
like to
appears.
hear what Councilman Smith had to say about this. Go ahead.
Thank you, Councilman. Councilman Smith, please.
John, you must have been doing this for a while because you answered my question before I had the chance to ask it. which was how exactly did this get to this point without a site plan?
Yeah.
I really don't know that I have anything else to say, as I would not approve something that didn't have a site plan with it anyways.
Yes.
So if that message happens to get out there to this applicant, they might want to consider a withdrawal before we have the chance to deny it.
I will convey that.
Thank you, sir.
All right, guess that was clear. John, D, please.
Yes. This is a request to rezone a property at the 8200 block of Appleton Pike, a portion of a property from R1 residential to C2 convenience commercial zone for a proposed mixed-use office development. The property is located in, again, the 8200 block of Appleton Pike. If you're familiar with the Summit area, this is right at the entry to, Enterprise South. Here again, you see a close-up of the site. You can see that there is a large overhead power line easement that runs through part of the property. Let me just jump to the zoning. You can see the area is predominantly Zone C2 to begin with. There is a area of UGC in the front. And if you look at the site plan, I'm just going to jump to the site plan. Where do we go? Is that on here? All right, I'll have to get a site plan added to that. My apologies. There's a site plan that was submitted that shows basically this is going to be used for parking, and the reason they need to rezone this property is to accommodate parking. It's in the back portion of the site. Staff considered this was also consistent with the White Oak Mountain plan. It's recommended commercial at this location. Staff did not have any concerns, so we recommended approval, subject to some conditions to ensure compatibility. Since it's really being proposed just for parking, we added these conditions constraining the use, so that no vehicular repair, used car dealerships, repair facilities, auto record services, all those C2 type uses that would not be compatible with a residential, adjacent residential use. There was no opposition at Planning Commission. Planning Commission concurred with staff's recommendation to add those three conditions. One, no vehicular repair facilities, dealerships, as I mentioned before, trees are placed along the front street yard to match surrounding per CDOT review and approval, and rear pedestrian access be granted to the adjoining property owner. So those are the three conditions which are consistent with the property to the front. We're trying to carry those conditions to be consistent for the entire site. There was no opposition. Applicant was fine with staff's recommendation, and both PC and staff recommend approval with those three conditions.
Thank you, John. This is in District 4. You've pretty much covered anything I would have concerns with, and then also due to add to this case is that the Summit area is on the move. We're going to see a lot of more action in the future in the Summit area with the expansion of Volkswagen and the entire area. So I think y'all did a great job at recommending the conditions that you did.
Thank you.
Thanks. Councilman Gilbert, did you have a comment, sir?
Just a brief question. John, can you show me exactly what's next to this property?
Sure. Go to the area. You can see it's almost all power line easement. There are some homes on to the south, of the power line, but you see that kind of that clear light green going through the yellow? That's a overhead power line easement, transmission line. So they're using a lot of this site for parking. They're putting the buildings closer to the front on Appleton Pike, and they need that rear section for parking. So they will have to do screening per the landscape regs anytime you have a commercial zone abutting a residential zone. So that'll all be covered. We just wanted to constrain the uses so not to have a lot of any potential impactful uses to the rear.
Thanks, I appreciate it. The reason I was concerned, that's my old stomping grounds. I was looking at it.
All right.
Thank you, Councilman. John, we are down to E, please.
Okay. Yes, this is a request to rezone from R1 residential to C2 convenience commercial zone and R3 residential zone at 5600 block of Clark Road for basically apartment development and gas station. This is an area, speaking about getting ready to change, there's a lot of potential for this location. As you know, Ferdinand Peach Way, which is going to open up soon if it hadn't already. I know it's close to being fully opened. It's going to empty out right here at this location. So a lot of jobs that we've heard have already been announced for the Enterprise South Park. This will be a major gateway to that park. So clearly, as all that transpires, there will be changes in land use that will occur. Here you see the site. Again, it's a large vacant site. You do have some subdivision to the west of this site. the Jewel Road subdivision. On the northwest corner, which is the lower left-hand side, you got a vacant pad, some kind of formal commercial site. On the northeast corner is a granite countertop store. So there is some commercial already in the area. What they're wanting to do is to rezone it, the large portion of the tract to R3 to accommodate a multifamily unit development and then develop the corner as commercial. Here again, you see some images at this location. Here you see, again, the zoning map showing the existing commercial node that already exists at the Clark Road and Ferdinand Peach Way intersection. You do have R3, some R3 and R2 and R1 in this location. There has been no recent zoning history for this site. There was a zoning study conducted in 1992 to look at areas that were zoned for multifamily should be rezoned to R1. That was done in 1992. So there was some down zoning in this area back in 1992. Again, this shows you the current zoning map of the area. Here's what they're proposing. Again, you see most of the site will be zoned to R3, and then they would extend that C2 node out by about 170 linear feet to the west and about 93 feet to the north for some type of convenience commercial development at that intersection. The site plan presented shows an apartment development, 234 proposed units, about a density of about 17 units per acre, with a central pool facility, one main access point onto Highway 58 for the apartment complex, and a secondary one off of Clark Road. And you can see access points on Clark and Highway 58 for the proposed convenience store. I will note that staff did have some, this is I think one important nuance of this, that this is a state route. So the state's going to have some purview over this as well as the city. And looking at, I know there's some conversation about the signalization of this interchange. And is Blythe here? So he might have, I don't know if anything you want to add, any updates later. I know there's been some back and forth. They're aware of the need for a traffic signal at this location. I think it's a matter, as I understand, I think just completing the warrant study for that to be executed. Is that a fair statement? So I think that was one of the main concerns that the public presented at there's several things that we had some opposition. That was one of the concerns mentioned by the public at the meeting. I would say one of the things that staff, a couple things that relates to access, comments from our local staff. One, trying to minimize the number of curb cuts on Highway 58. The more curb cuts you have, that could interfere with turning movements coming out of Ferdinand Peach Way. So something like that would probably be considered as part of the permit review process. Also, the idea that it'd be good to have some kind of pedestrian connection from the apartments to the convenience store, so you're avoiding trips coming out onto the road just to get to the convenience store for daily needs. So staff, in looking at it, recommended approval subject to two conditions. One, no buildings within 50 feet along the north property line, and a pedestrian connection shall be provided between the residential and commercial uses. And the reason for that, we want to be sure to create some transition where you have a single-family residential to the north from this property. At Planning Commission, there was opposition. Again, some of the comments from opposition concerned about there being too many apartments out in this area. Is this a good location for apartments based on available services, as well as concerned about regulation of traffic along at the Clark Road intersection? After hearing comments from the public, the Planning Commission recommend approval of the request subject to 3 conditions, actually 6 conditions. One, a minimum 20-foot type A landscape buffer to be installed and maintained along the outer boundary of the R3. So providing that kind of transition protection between the apartments and the single family. A 5-foot tall vinyl coated chain link fence to be installed along the exterior boundary of the apartment development. All buildings set back a minimum of 50 feet from all exterior boundaries. Some controls on the location of dumpsters. 100 feet away from any adjoining residential zone properties. 2 vehicular entrances provided for the R3 development and 2 vehicular entrances provided for the C2 property as generally depicted in the applicant's site plan. And 6, pedestrian pathway be provided between the R3 and C2 properties. If I might add a comment, and I don't know if Blythe wants to add any more information to this. My general thought on number 5, you may not want to prescribe a specific entrance solution at this time, because sometimes when you have to do the analysis and the state gets involved, something could change. I don't know if Blythe, have you got any comments on that? But condition number 5, it specifically specifies 2 vehicular entrances provided for the R3 development and 2 vehicular entrances for the C2 property. Is that overly prescriptive? So just something to think about as you're deliberating on this as council. I remember we had a similar situation for another case Councilwoman Burrs is familiar with that we had to deal with on a right-of-way case. My recommendation is let the traffic study really determine where and how the entrances are provided as opposed to prescribing it at the zoning case level. That's my thought.
Thank you, John. Dr. Burrs, I have 2 lights. Just wanted to give you the, Councilman Smith has chimed in. Would you,
Well,
what's your preference?
let me go first because it may be helpful.
Yes, ma'am.
John, go all the way back where you showed the neighborhoods. Keep
Oh, the
going
aerial?
back. Wait a minute.
This one?
Keep going back.
That one?
All right. Yeah, that'll do it. So, for some reason, I call it gerrymandering. That's in my district. These neighborhoods on either side, are they in the city?
I think they're in the county.
That's what I thought. All right. So this is really weird because we had this wonderful meeting and got there, and I found out that I only represent the land. There must have been, how many people there, Mike? 100? Yeah, I mean, they were mobbed, and they didn't want this, no. So I said, how many of you live in the city? And not one of them lived in the city. And so I said, well, okay, so I don't represent any of you, but Mr. Bangston does. And I said, so he would be the one to speak for you. However, I can tell you the process, and that's about as far as we went. I just have one question about
Yes.
it. I have no problems with it, and I guess this goes to you, Mike. The filling station, what's the purpose of that?
The applicant has been approached and has under contract that corner lot for a
Has it
convenience
under
store.
contract?
Subject to
even be-
rezoning.
Oh, subject to rezoning.
Yes, ma'am.
That was the only piece I had a problem with, was the commercial there. What happens if it goes away?
Well, you put a financial hit on the development, and if you really look at that particular corner, given that that's a major intersection with a signal about to be turned on at some point and a back door going into Volkswagen, it's really set up for something along those lines.
Okay, and what I didn't see, so there are a couple of things I didn't see, and I'm just talking about the land. The people will have to fend for themselves. They're all going to show up at this meeting next week.
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, all right. The chain link fence, vinyl coated, I thought they wanted a solid fence. Did that change?
Well, what happened is at Planning Commission, the staff had 2 conditions, we offered 6. And our experience has found that since we're exceeding the buffer requirements, doubling from a 10 to a 20 foot, so we're already adding additional plantings. If I go with a solid fence, what happens is the vegetation does not flourish as well as it might. So we found over the years that a vinyl coated fence, which provides the security from keeping people in and out, but lets the vegetation really take hold and provide the screening.
Is the fence going to be outside on the perimeter? So I'm not looking at a chain link fence. I'm looking at a bunch of trees and stuff, and then at the outside of the perimeter is the fence.
It's around the perimeter. What we've found is and that's why it's vinyl coated, if it's black or green, it sort of blends in and it doesn't stick out like the old galvanized
Sure.
fences do.
Okay. Well, let me say that I think it's a good project. There were a lot of angry people, and they will probably be here. I don't represent any of them. So,
All I would add to that is, to me, if we're trying to put housing next to jobs, you get all these jobs going to Volkswagen, and you want to create, well, literally somebody could live here and walk to work or take their bike. This is a good location. I think, to me, that's why when we have these job centers, it's good to have housing nearby, because that cuts out on transportation costs going to and from your job site.
and it's good housing. It's very nice housing. So I know that Councilman Gilbert represents some areas on Highway 58, and I know that Councilman Smith has some interest. Where do we pick back up again?
And in terms of, talking about area plans?
Well, does this affect any of their constituents?
I gotta look at the council map again. It's kind of, like I say, it's kind of weird, the way yours kind of cuts
It's very
across.
weird. The last time with that other project, again, I threw a wonderful community meeting and found everybody lived in their districts.
what,
I
High
don't
Road?
have any people.
Yep.
So how does that affect them? I don't know.
They could probably tell you better than I could.
What do you think?
Well, let's find out. Councilman Smith, you want to take a swing at that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So as I understand it, and Councilwoman Burrs hit my question before I had a chance to ask it, as I expected that to be the case. But all along Highway 58, this little piece, of course, is just a sliver of 58 that's in the city, not the actual. You like me having to get that sliver word in there for you, Bird. It's not actually the residences in that area, so it doesn't impact me. I don't believe it impacts Councilman Gilbert at all, except directly across the street. He may have a little bit, but I don't think so. I think this section is purely 6 that comes through here. So I pick up further down, one exit down, as I believe Councilman Gilbert does on the other side as well. So I would say I'm in full support of this project taking place out in this area, Councilwoman. I'd be more than happy to support you in that. And if Commissioner Bankston has an issue with it, maybe he'd be willing to help us out with Champion Road that he's denied me assistance with to help his constituents out. So that's all I have to say about that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right, no glove thrown down there. Councilman Gilbert, what do you have to add to this?
Well, John,
Yes, sir.
we're going to have a lot more of this happening, and this is a great opportunity to have that next study in this particular area, because we're going to get a lot of this, and it's a growth area, and the citizens, the constituents want to know what's going on, so we have the opportunity to explain it to them. But it's
And I
fine
would
with
say,
me.
managed appropriately. I know you're worried about trying to revitalize Highway 58 corridor. You need rooftops. And having well-designed, appropriately placed apartments with the other amenities can help with that. But you got to have, it takes housing to
Right.
drive retail.
And this opportunity, Ken Smith's area for Walmart, maybe revisit that again, since people are beginning to start showing interest. So that's a good thing.
Yep.
Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Very good. Thank you, John. Thank you for those comments. I can tell you that property off North Hickory Valley Road has been quite interesting to hear a discussion about that. So maybe.
All right.
All right, John.
This is a request on Bonnie Oaks Drive, across from Silverdale Baptist Church. The request to rezone from R1 residential to R4 special zone for a proposed hospice and administration office. Again, if you look at the uses, again, this site is vacant. There is some single family to the north of this property off of Old Cleveland Pike, but you do have institutional uses across the street to the south. I mentioned the church. Also had a recent case to rezone to C2 for a coffee shop on the southeast corner of Silverdale Road. Again, here's looking into the site. There is one home currently on the site. It's mostly vacant. There is a creek that runs through the lower right-hand side of this development in a floodplain. You can see this, it consists of several parcels. Most of the area is zoned R1. There was a site that was zoned RZ1. You see that kind of hashed yellow. That was rezoned RZ1. My notes here. Back in 1998 for a zero lot line development. That simply means small lots or offset homes on small lots. So I mentioned the rezoning case to R1. There hasn't been any other zoning history other than the C2 that I mentioned for a restaurant or coffee shop. Here is a site plan showing the proposed location. It does indicate two entrances, one off of Bonnie Oaks Drive, another entrance off of Old Cleveland Pike. It shows the main, there's an administrative office building on the, I guess that would be the west-hand side. On the eastern portion of the property adjacent to the creek, you'd have the residential facility, the parking in the middle, and you show that having some kind of a passive park where most of the floodplain is on the lower right-hand side of the site. The plan for this area is the Shallowford Road Lee Highway Plan recommends single-unit residential, but it does note that this location may be appropriate for a higher density residential in the future as part of some overall plan development. I mentioned the floodplain. You can see some of the site is impacted by the floodplain and floodway. Staff found that the request would be compatible with the land use plan, particularly when it was a planned development that basically minimize impact on the adjacent floodway and floodplain. There are uses, though, associated with R4 that may not be appropriate. And so staff did recommend limiting the uses to ensure compatibility with the adjacent residential properties to the north. So staff recommended approve subject to 3 conditions: a residential office and institutional uses only, 2, no buildings or permanent structures within the protected floodway of the Southeast Fire Branch. And we kind of spelled out those parcels. Those are the 3, I guess the 2 conditions. At Planning Commission, there was opposition, and most of the opposition didn't have to do with the use. It was the traffic that would be using Old Cleveland Pike because it's a small road. They weren't sure, to what degree this facility might impact traffic volume on that street. Staff, after hearing from the comments from the public, concur with staff's recommendation for the most part. Some changes to the limitations on the floodplain. Essentially, the 2 conditions recommended by Planning Commission were 1, residential office and institutional uses only, and 2, that no buildings or permanent structures permitted in the protected floodway as opposed to floodplain.
Thank you, John. Dr. Burrs, you have the floor. Try one more time. Hit it again.
Hit your button.
Now? Okay. It's a great project. It's a really good, I've heard no opposition. And it's something that's much needed, and it's a quality project. So thank you.
You're welcome.
That take care of your?
It does.
All right, that was simple. John, can you talk just a little bit about that condition about staying out of the flood
Sure.
way?
Sure. The difference is, as you know, right now, technically, I don't know that you really need condition number 2 because by law you cannot. Now, I guess technically you could get a permit to actually cross or put up. You'd have to elevate above that floodway. I don't think you can disturb it. So technically, you can't, by law, impact the floodway anyway. Staff, in looking at the site plan, noted that based on their proposal, they were showing it's a minimum. Basically, it was like a park, which would still require some kind of a bridge going over the creek and a trail. Staff was considering, well, basically, if they're not planning on using it for any permanent structure as a building, then it might be appropriate to limit development in the floodplain at that location. I think the applicant presented some information as it relates to, well, it can kind of be, in terms of what's considered a structure, that may limit your ability to put a gazebo or a trail. And so I think where the applicant tried to meet staff halfway, say, hey, we'll just at least for sure stay out of the floodway. And then Planning Commission, after hearing that, concurred with, basically with the applicant's thoughts on that, and approved it, limiting development outside the floodway as opposed to floodplain.
Very good. Councilman Gilbert, I see your light.
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
And this might be a question for Blight. Hey, Blight, come on up. And John.
Okay.
Since this is happening, it's going to be more in this area also growing. Where are we at? I know this is a state question, but you might can answer it. Where are we at with the development of Bonnie Oaks? Because right now it's bad traffic up that through that way when it comes to Silverdale School. Then you look at Amazon, and then you look at Volkswagen. Where are we at? And I know we had 3 phases to this. We had one. This is the first phase, if I'm not mistaken. Then you had a third, and a second and a third. There's 4.
I think there's 4.
Okay. Well, I think this was the first one, if I'm not mistaken. So where are we at? 'Cause I know the bridges was an issue.
Yeah, I think you're right. There's a railroad bridge issue, and I think they were starting eastward and going westward. I don't know the updates, but I'll find out for you.
I appreciate it because that does affect a lot. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you, Councilman. John, I have no other lights on this item. We'll move to G.
Okay, this is a request to rezone a properties in the Old Town St. Emily area from C2 convenience zone to UGC commercial zone to accommodate a redevelopment project on a couple blocks. Let me zoom in. The applicant is proposing to, if you're familiar with the climbing center, which is that middle block in the middle of the screen, and then you have, I guess it's a multi-tenant commercial building to the south where the 1886 restaurant is. And then there's a third parcel, which is currently mostly undeveloped on the north side, where they're proposing to put a parking garage. So it's kind of like 3 different elements or aspects to the development, right in the heart of the old St. Elmo. Here's another view looking into the site, looking from the opposite way, looking from north, looking south. Actually, I'm sorry, that's, let me get my bearings right. That's actually east looking west. Again, you can see the middle there is the rock wall climbing facility. To the left, you have the multi-tenant commercial building with the 1886 restaurant. And then to the right, you see that parcel. It does have 1 building on it. We're proposing to put a parking garage. Here's some images showing you the character development. It's basically 1, 2, and 3-story buildings currently in the area. If you look at the zoning patterns in this area, it's a mix. I mean, you do have some M1 zoning. But I would say the core of the commercial area is mostly C2 with 1 UGC zone that was approved, if you recall, a few years back. We approved a UGC for a multi-story apartment development on Old Mountain Road. Okay, I just mentioned the zoning history there. So clearly the C2 zone is really not consistent with the desired development pattern in this area. C2 has large setbacks and parking requirements that are not consistent with urban redevelopment. UGC is a better fit zone for the type of pattern we want to see this location. And so clearly that's a better option than C2. UGC does have some challenges. And so, which I'll get to in a minute. Here it again looks at the proposed site plan from the applicant showing the opportunity to infill that parking lot area in between with some new shops and a new building. The areas in blue you see are new buildings. There'll be a pedestrian alley on one portion of the site. And you see on the right-hand side will be a multi-story parking garage with some shops on the ground floor and a potential hotel to the far right. Here is again a rendering provided by the applicant showing that form will look like as developed. Here's another view. Again, the idea of creating that alley connection, which is great, kind of to break up that long facade, having some kind of an urban alley, pedestrian alley connecting Tennessee and St. Elmo Avenue in the middle. Again, just showing some examples of the kind of animation that they would propose facades for this development. I do want to emphasize that while this is certainly the applicant's intent, what we're approving is essentially a zone. So just remember that. The CNMO plan staff consulted with does recommend the redevelopment of the CNMO Town Center consistent with a historic urban character. So staff felt that the zone is consistent with the land use plan and certainly a better zone than C2 for this location in terms of promoting urban development. And we did recommend, not that it would be Historic Zoning Commission approval of this project, but that there be a consultation, mainly to provide some insights in terms of the historic character elements that the applicant might want to consider as they fulfill the development. So that was noted in the staff report. But essentially, staff did recommend approval with about 6 conditions. And again, those are trying to do a combination of things, address some height limitations, because since the predominant height in the area is mostly 2 and 3 stories, staff put a recommendation of limiting the height to 3 stories. You see condition number 3 is maintaining an alley connection, through connection between St. Elmo Avenue and Tennessee Avenue. We did add a minimum building frontage requirement because UGC does not have a minimum building frontage requirement currently. That is something that is common in form-based code, and so we actually use that 70% number based on the form-based code standards. We also excluded all auto-oriented uses because that's, again, it's not consistent with the overall St. Elmo development form and use structure. So anyway, we had 6 conditions that were recommended as part of that recommendation. At Planning Commission, there was no opposition. The applicant did have some concerns with the staff's conditions and asked that they be removed except for 2, 1 limiting the uses, and 2 that maintaining that pedestrian through connection. So Planning Commission concurred with the applicant's request to just limit it to 2 conditions with the UGC. So both Planning Commission staff recommend approval, just with different conditions.
Very good. Councilman Oglesby, would you like to, there it is, there's your light.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is a great project for, it's actually, John, not Old St. Elmo, it's downtown St. Elmo now.
Yes,
okay?
sir, I remember that.
Don't want to offend my constituents. Even though there were no opposition at the Planning Commission meeting, there will be some at our meeting next week. I met with the Neighborhood Association last night, and there is some concern about the building height. Sort of about a 50-50 split, but the building height fits what the code says it can do. The other concern is they're requesting a traffic study, which I spoke with Mr. Bailey earlier today. The challenge with that is that most of the traffic that is a concern for that area is the traffic that's coming in and out of Georgia.
Sure.
And with the development that's going on just south of St. Elmo, that's going to be a problem. But overall, the citizens of St. Elmo is really excited about what this can bring to the area because they were talking about challenges with the flow of bringing people to the area because some of the businesses has not been successful because they haven't had enough traffic. So those constituents that really like this see this as an avenue to help grow their small businesses and create some great opportunities in the downtown St. Elmo area. So that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Chairman. Councilman Mitchell, I see your light.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can you go back one slide?
This?
This was staff recommendations?
Yes, sir.
And then the next one was what was actually approved by Planning Commission?
That's correct.
Or recommended by Planning Commission, I should say? Okay, go back one more time. I just want to see. Do you have anything else to say about any of these
I think
following conditions that?
I think the most important one is the minimum frontage requirement. The rest of it, I can understand that, would be helpful, but the one that I think is most important is having some kind of minimum building frontage requirement if you're trying to do urban development. Because technically, you could put a Butler building, a 10-foot Butler building on a lot, and leave the rest of it open and not, have any issues as far as UGC. So that's something to think about. Again, my understanding seemed like that the applicant is wanting to do the right thing. They've got a good team with them. But just to caution you that, as you know, we're
Financing doesn't come through and they sell it off,
That's
what
right.
happens?
So you got to think long-term. So just something to chew on. I'll leave it at that.
Okay, go to the last slide. I want to see the two existing units. Okay. So you're really talking about pedestrian connectivity and no accessory
Yeah.
warehouses or adult-oriented establishments, and that's the only,
Yeah, the UGC would require, of course, to put the building on the street. There's a maximum height of 4 stories. There has to be a primary pedestrian entrance on the street. Parking has to be located to the rear. So there are standards in the UGC. It's just, we've known through past history that there are some weaknesses too. And so that's the reason that staff made those conditions. I guess me speaking to you as a professional, I'd ask that you strongly consider the minimum building frontage requirement.
okay. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes, sir.
You're
Thank
right,
you,
it's a great
Councilman
project.
Mitchell. John, to piggyback on the Planning Commission's recommendation, I think it was rooted in a lot of adding conditions to UGC as setting a precedence for UGC and basically amending it to where it's no longer recognizable as UGC. I think that comment was made, and
Sure.
that's where some of this came into play. Also, like rooftop screening, and some of that I think is already covered or will be covered in the under UGC.
Yep.
Was kind of redundant, if I recall correctly,
Um,
from the applicant.
I'm not sure about, I have to double check the standards on that part. Yeah, I would say, if you really I call it the Pareto principle, the 80-20 rule, what really matters. To me, I think among those 6 conditions, the one that really, in my opinion, that's most important in addition to these 2 is the minimum frontage. I think, I hear you on those other ones.
Great, thank you. Let's move on to H, please.
Okay. This is a request to rezone a piece of property from R1 to C2 commercial zone to construct. Wait a minute, no, I'm not. That's the wrong one, y'all. Sorry about that. Jump to the front again. This is a request to rezone a piece of property in Highland Park from R1 zone to RTZ residential zone for essentially 2 detached single-family homes, be able to get them on a smaller lot frontage. The property is located at the 1505 East 14th Street in Highland Park. You can see the surrounding uses are all single-family detached. Again, jumping ahead, I think what's really important, in my opinion, when you look at these cases is lot frontages. They're proposing essentially 30-foot frontages. There are lots on this block that are 45 feet and 50, so it's a little bit smaller than some of the lots on this block. But we have approved RTZ zones and other locations to allow those smaller lot frontages. So based on the history of what we've already done in other locations in Highland Park, staff recommended to approve with some conditions. Let me jump to that real quick. Here we go. One, that it'd be single-family detached residential, because RTZ allows also attached, and that would not be an appropriate form on this block, because they're all detached structures, as well as that vehicular access and parking shall be from the rear alley, and subdivision to no more than 2 residential lots. So trying to make sure that it limits to 2 lots, not 3 or 4. So that was staff's recommendation. There was no opposition at Planning Commission. Planning Commission concurred with staff's recommendation to approve with those 3 conditions.
Very good. Councilman Byrd, any comments, sir? No comments at all. John, I guess we're going to move into our amendments.
Yes, we have 2 zoning text amendments. One dealt with how we define screening. Currently, again, manufacturing zones do include landscaping and screening from residential zones. They're typically less restricted than landscape regulations. The M1 manufacturing zone requires, as you see noted above, requires a 30-foot landscape buffer around outdoor storage areas. And it's been a challenge for LDO to enforce. It's difficult to comply with also with existing properties that are zoned M1. So it's one thing if you got a greenfield site that's M1 as opposed to an M1 in a urban situation. And if you're just changing the use, how do you retrofit a tight urban site with a required urban buffer? So we wanted to clarify that language to provide some more flexibility. The other thing we wanted to do is clarify in the C2 basically how you do screening for mini warehouses and outdoor storage. That's been a challenge also for LDO to enforce in terms of maintaining some consistency. So we provide some definitions for outdoor storage, motor vehicle, passenger vehicle, junk vehicle, vehicle sales areas, and automobile sales. Here again, you see what we're suggesting to try to avoid duplication. You can see on the left the manufacturing zoning requirements compared to the landscape ordinance requirements, trying to make those more consistent. So what we want to do is delete the required 30-foot landscape buffer in the M1 zone and replace as noted here below. So you still got to do the screening, you just don't have to do it in a 30-foot area. So it says outdoor storage areas proposed as part of new development or change of use in M1 manufacturing zone, M2 or M3 and M4 shall be screened on all all sides per the following. So you provide a fence that's opaque. Again, and if there's any outdoor storage, you'd have a minimum 8-foot unpaved planting area in front of the fence. And then we want to be clear that vehicle sales areas as defined within these regulations are exempt. So if you're doing vehicular sales, clearly you don't need to screen it. So we also added definitions for what constitutes outdoor storage from enforcement to be clear what is outdoor storage. And so we added a clear definition so that gives staff the tools to enforcement, as well as what is a motor vehicle versus a passenger vehicle. So that's important again, and it comes to regulating what you can have and not have in outdoor storage areas. So this gives staff some tools to more effectively enforce any violations in terms of compliance with outdoor storage, and provide some flexibility in urban locations where you've got a manufacturing zone. You still screen, you're just not doing it in a 30-foot wide buffer area. So that's probably a lot for you to digest that I just kind of went over in 3 minutes. So if you have any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
Well, John, I've got a couple lights, so let's get started.
The fire hose.
Councilman Gilbert.
Yes, sir.
Hello, John.
Yes, sir.
How will this affect the situation on Bonnie Oaks? I call it junkyard, but he called it not a junkyard. But how will does this affect that area any kind of way?
This affects in terms of what can be considered storage of equipment versus junk.
Who defines junk versus equipment? For us, I know you're pointing at Dallas back there. He's chilling out back there, but Dallas is familiar with this situation on Bonnie Oaks, and I consider it junk, and the person that owns the product consider it equipment. So how do we define which one is which?
Well, it says commercial vehicles shall include basically, if it's not movable, it's considered junk. It's got to be a movable, and otherwise it's got to be screened. I think the idea is you can have a motor vehicle or a passenger vehicle, but if you've got any other of those above mentioned items, you have to screen it.
So this is going to affect them for us making them clean up the area, correct?
You can see here, I mean, now I've got to this next screen, we define what a junk vehicle is.
Well, he has a lot of air conditioning things. He got trucks and junk.
Yep.
There, and I was making sure that if this goes in effect, that he has to clean up some of that junk, because it was in the process of getting cleaned up, but all of a sudden we denied his zoning, and he just kind of stopped, and it's still junk.
Well, part of the issue is having a definition of what is junk and what isn't.
Right.
And so this more clearly defines that, so staff doesn't have to get into a back and forth with the property owner about what constitutes junk.
Well,
I don't think he did this for, but he still got junk down there. It's clearly defined some vehicle
Junk. Okay, right.
But this helps clarify that, this makes it even clearer that he violates that.
The vehicles, motor vehicles, that kind of stuff, but this isn't gonna give him any leeway on that.
Okay. And one more thing, the mini warehouses off of Highway 58, Mr. Brock,
Mm-hmm.
does this affect that property any kind of way on this, resolution?
It, let me address that right. I
There's-
think these slides might help you. So we really want to differentiate between indoor storage and outdoor storage. If you're doing mini warehouses, which is what you see in this screen right here, then you have to screen those structures as well as your outdoor storage. If you're doing like climate-controlled indoor storage, you don't have to screen it because it looks like a building. It's when you have, you know what I'm talking about, it looks like a line of garages, right? When you have a line of garages or any outdoor storage area, we're saying that you need to screen that entire perimeter.
I think right now it's it's a C5. So you still cannot put these things in a C5,
No, not in
correct?
C5, C2 only.
C2 only,
Yep.
or M1. Because at first, originally, it was on M1. They want to put there, and we
Right.
denied the M1. Then we did C5, but now he wants to put a C2, so he put a C2. You can put,
If you screen it,
if you screen it, with this ordinance.
that's correct.
But
And I
without
think
this ordinance, you couldn't do it, correct?
He still couldn't store junk.
Well, this is another guy. This is another situation. I'm up there off Moses Circle, next to a residential area. They own some property. It used to be Cannon property, now it's not. And this person
Right.
bought it as Brock. They want to put mini storages back there. The community do not want it at all because it brings some negativity.
Right.
And we kind of stopped it, but I'm just trying to see, does this resolution change that so that allow them to put many storage buildings in the backside of Mimosa Circle?
From a use perspective, this does not change. This really just describes how you screen things. And, because you can do limited outdoor storage in C2 now.
Right.
But the problem was being clear about how you screen it and also differentiating between a mini warehouse building or versus an indoor. And so what we're trying to say is, which also, I think, which is kind of, I will say we're trying to encourage folks, hey, if you do indoor storage where it looks like a structure, it's all climate controlled inside, you don't have to screen the entire building because it looks like a structure. But if you're going to do something that is outdoor storage in nature or garage individual units, you're going to have to screen the entire site because that's what's unsightly from the right of way. Does anybody have any questions about that?
Yeah, I understand that part, but I'm just saying this would not change indoor mini storage currently.
Not
For
that I'm aware. I
zoning.
will double confirm that. My understanding is no, it does not. As far as from a use perspective, this does not change the use allowances that are currently in place in C2. But I will confirm that before next week.
I appreciate it. Thanks.
Good, Councilman?
Yes.
Looks like I'm going in the 7-foot fence business. Dr. Burrs?
Okay. I think you're going to see more and more applications for these things.
That's correct. Yep.
So I'm wondering, right now, it takes 30 feet, which may limit the usage. And if you narrow it to 10, in other words, if I have a piece of property,
Right.
I can think of several now. And if there's a piece of property, you're actually giving me more room if you limit to 10 to put in warehouses, the mini warehouses, that I might not have been able to put in before.
Well, this would be, just to be clear, that would be an M1.
I don't, where,
Yeah, okay, I got you.
all right. And I'm not in favor of making it easier
Right.
to put in these things. You know, if people are complaining, I can't comply with this,
Right.
then we'll miss them. But why are we making it easier?
Right.
for them to do that. It would seem that as we grow and change, we would make it even more difficult. That's not what we're looking for.
Well, an M1 zone, the use you can, we're running into problems, and I hear what you're saying, is saying, hey, you need to accommodate more space that we're trying to discourage. So I guess the question would be, though, I can see that in a C2 scenario maybe, but in M1 where it's already a industrial type zone. And what we're seeing is you got somebody who's got some kind of a small workshop, whatever, and they just got an area on their site where they're keeping some equipment or materials that they use as part of their business. Right now, by M1 standards, I cannot store that equipment without providing for a 30-foot landscape yard on some very small sites. Now, to your point, you could say there is a process today, and that's the variance process. Now, I think what Phil will tell you is the variance board would not likely give you a variance unless you had some really outstanding circumstances in terms of the physical conditions of the property itself.
And hardship is what they
Yeah.
base it on, and
Yeah.
that's what they should base it on.
Yep.
My question is, why would we make it easier for folks to, I know what you're talking about with storage, but to
Yeah.
junk up areas?
I tell you what, we'll bring some examples. It may be worth just, my recommendation, if there's some questions around, maybe both of these, maybe defer just one more week, and I could maybe at next week's, if that's, it depends on what the will of council is, if you think it's appropriate to defer, I can give you some examples. I know in working with the LDO office through the landscape enforcement process, I would want to get with them to show you all some specific examples of what we're talking about, and that might inform your thought whether or not you want to still say, hey, you just need to go through a variance
Well,
process.
unfortunately, none of this is retroactive, okay?
Right.
You can't apply it retroactively. So, yeah, you can't apply it retroactively. I mean, legally you can't. So I'm saying from this time forward, why would we encourage people to think about doing that?
Part of this is in reaction to, we've said, they've always make the argument, I have an existing grocery store. My parking lot's there. Our code currently says parking is for the storage of vehicles, and vehicles is basically anything that's got wheels on it by our code. So it's hard to say, you change the use of the building, but your parking lot allows vehicle storage now. It's hard to go this would allow us a tool to make them screen the parking lot as well when they do the mini storage warehouse
I'm
in the
with you.
buildings. So does this make it easier? What this does is give us a real tool for the existing buildings. Now, if you want wider screening or whatever, but that's where we keep we've had the argument, and their attorneys always just go, read your definitions. Your definitions already allow.
Your definitions, I agree with.
Yeah,
Your
but-
definitions. It's the fact that there's two parts of this. One is if you have these things that we've designed, then you have to screen them. And right now, you would have to screen them 30 feet. Is that correct?
And again, I see it's two situations. Think the M1 zone situation and the C2
Well,
situation.
we can take them separately. The principle is
Right.
that we want screening, all right? You're absolutely right about the definition. I mean, we've run into that a couple of times. So you need the definitions. What I'm saying is, given the definitions, and given the fact that you can't apply this stuff retroactively, the lawyers would really have a field day with that.
Sure.
You're talking about going
Future,
forward.
that's correct.
So if I'm thinking about doing something with a piece of property, C2, M1, whatever it is, I would hope that the city would say, look, you want to do this? Okay, but we're very stringent about the ways you can do it. And I'm saying that if we make it easier
Right.
to put it on a piece of property, then I'm wondering if we're not defeating where we want to go with this. That's all I'm
Understood.
saying.
And my only other just food for thought would be, there's a context of, 'cause I think there are two different situations which still have the both same answers. One is outdoor storage, which is not necessarily many warehouses, associated with some kind of small manufacturing operation in an urban location. And it may be, hey, we still want a 30-foot buffer even in that situation. So I think there's that conversation, and then there's a conversation about how we treat mini warehouses and outdoor storage in C2. In my understanding, there's really two different problems that we're trying to solve to accomplish the objective of screening. I would say in the case of the C2, avoiding the conflict or creating more clarity about how you screen outdoor storage and what you do with the mini warehouse versus indoor climate control. In the case of M1, it's, okay, what do we do if I've got an existing site and I'm adding some kind of some materials as part of my operations? How do we create more flexibility? Which you say, hey, we may not want to do that because we're trying to have some really big requirements for screening even in that situation. But there are two different situations.
I get you. In other words, if somebody has a piece of property in my district and wants to put many warehouses in it, I don't want to make it easier.
Right.
I want to make it, if it has to go there, because it's allowable
Right.
in a C2, then I want the 30-foot buffer. At least make them rethink what's happening.
I think currently, if they just built the buildings, there would be no screening requirement in a C2 because they're allowed by right. And then if you do put outdoor storage, it's 15 feet, one row of trees, one row of shrubs. This would reduce that, but put in a solid fence where you couldn't see through there. and then
Okay,
put
so I want
some
to
landscaping in front of it.
I want the solid fence. I want the shrubbery.
Right.
But for many warehouses, I don't want to make it easier. So I would say with many warehouses, you're talking about the fence, the shrubbery, and make it larger than 10 feet. All right? I'm agreeing with what you're saying. I'm thinking we haven't considered unintended consequences before the fact. And as a result, right now, our city is getting kind of ugly with these storage thingies. And I think we need to be thinking about that, that's all.
Yeah, my recommend, per that, I think it's worth scrutinizing this a little closer. We want to get it right.
Thank you.
And so if it's with the chair's condolences, if y'all are, it's up to you, y'all's decision as council, but if we want to defer action on it for a week, we could do one more. Well, I'll leave it up to y'all's call how you want to.
Well, I could say I'd be willing to bless that with my colleagues' permission and approval. I'm looking around. I'm not seeing a disagreement, but I do have more lights, John, so I'm going to have.
Sure.
Dr. Burrs, can I move to another speaker for the moment? You good? Yes, ma'am. Councilman Henderson?
John, can you go back to
Oop, wrong way.
So, is that definition not a little subjective, the vehicle's junk? I mean, economically infeasible to restore.
What I know in terms of how this came up, what we do is there's a guide on coming up with definitions that my staff consults. And based on language used in a lot of the places, we use that to kind of come up with a definition. I don't know if Dallas wants to add any comments as far as economically infeasible.
I know when we condemn a house, it has to be a percentage of whatever the house would be worth if it was up to par. I mean, to me, that looks like you could go out there and, in the eyes of the code inspector, determine almost any car that's needs repair, economically infeasible. I mean, it's probably an older model. Is there any consideration given to an antique vehicle in this definition?
I don't think it speaks to that. And
I
that
mean,
as
because
stated-
obviously, antique vehicle, there are some people who would put any amount of money in to restoring those.
I think these definitions, I think there's, to be clear, I think are intended to clarify as it relates to what you put in an outdoor storage or not, to kind of what Councilman Gilbert's comments are about, just accumulation of junk, what's really outdoor storage versus junk. And so the purpose of these definitions was to help to, like, for example, this doesn't get into the inoperable vehicles in somebody's yard or that kind of situation. This is dealing with strictly in terms of what you put in an outdoor storage area in a commercial type zone, correct? So if your worry is somebody's coming on somebody's residential property saying, okay, you've got a junk vehicle, is that kind of, or are you thinking even in a commercial context? Make sure I'm following your line of thinking.
Well, particularly maybe even in an antique vehicle, you might want to, I don't know, I'm just saying if somebody stored those in an outdoor storage
Right.
to restore.
Well, we'll do some work on looking at that aspect. So I think what I hear you saying is, if there's an antique vehicle, how do we ensure that it's not getting caught up in being defined as junk?
Yeah,
I will certainly do some research on it.
okay.
Good counsel, thank you. John, I don't know if the insurance industry can lend any assistance on that when it comes to totaling out a vehicle. They may have some parameters
Okay?
that might help.
We'll look into that.
Very good. Councilman Gilbert, I see your light.
Oh, me, I'm sorry. Go back. Oh,
Please, sir. Try
Okay,
again.
I can hear.
There
Okay.
you go.
Going back to what Councilwoman was saying, if we got 30 feet, why can't we just say put screen beyond, right next to 30 feet, instead of making it 10 feet? That way, we kind of kill two birds with one stone. And the reason why I say a lot of this, because the city has annexed a lot of areas that used to be in the county.
right.
And during them times, county, in my opinion, didn't care what they put out there. They just went and did the zoning, because a lot of areas in 58, it's ridiculous zoning. And once they already zoned that, and they're in the city now, we might get to this point where they help putting all these storage buildings, mini buildings, and the buffer is kind of just 10 feet, and you got a house right next to it,
Right.
a residential, even though it's an M1, but you got residential right here. And how's it going to protect that residential if we do that, the 10 feet? I rather just keep it at 30 and then put the fence or whatever up after 30.
I hear you loud and clear.
Thanks.
Thank you, Councilman. I see no other lights, John. Before we move on to the next amendment. I'm
Add some more
curious-
complexity to the mix.
Yeah. My question in listening to the conversation is, are we replacing landscaping for wooden fences? And that's kind of my fear. I mean, I feel like that's what we're losing. Am I hearing that wrong? Because I still believe, I said this before, the best day a wooden fence is built is the day it goes in, and then it's all downhill from there. But are we losing our landscaping or relaxing our landscaping requirements in lieu of or in favoring a wooden fence?
I don't see, you want to answer that?
I was just going to say, we have landscape screening from zone to zone.
Right.
And as the properties develop, that would go in, whether it's mini storage warehouse or a doctor's office in a C2. There's a screening requirement between that and residential. What this would do, or I think some of what that would do, was if it's already C2 and you want to put mini storage warehouses, that we could enforce some kind of screening requirement. Right now, there's not a screening requirement unless you do outdoor storage associated with those little metal buildings with all the
Okay.
garage
But I guess
doors.
I'll ask again,
So, but
are we relaxing our landscaping in lieu of or in
We're probably
substitution
making it
for?
tighter, but we're adding a fence Right now, I think the
Okay.
landscaping's the same, it just has to be 15 feet of grass with one row of trees and one row of shrubs rather than 8 feet kind of
Okay,
compact.
so we are relaxing a little bit on landscaping requirements with adding
We-
your fence.
I think when you say green space, yes, if you count the grass,
Okay.
but the
Well,
amount
it's
of trees and shrubs would be the same, they're just planted closer together.
I understand.
So, we're
Yeah.
basically adding a fence. You could leave the 15 feet and just add the opaque fence,
Yeah,
and it makes sure you get you can't see. We're basically screening the fence, and the fence is what screens the
product.
holiness of the
Sure.
C2, I
I
guess.
Yeah.
think we can do it the next time to give some more visuals, is
I was
show.
gonna say, is there any way we can
what
see
it-
some examples
Yeah,
of
pictures
what
worth a
this is?
1,000 words, right? So I think having a.
I've
we'll
never
do
said
it-
that.
We'll, we'll show some examples of what's currently from a visual perspective versus what would it be like with the changes. And I think that might help clarify
Okay.
a lot of questions.
Very good. Well, before we go off this subject, do I have consensus that we'd like to maybe kick this down the road a week? Okay. I think I'm not getting any no's, so we'll take that as a yes, John.
Thank you, sir.
Give us a little more time. Thank you, and I appreciate the hard work on all this.
No problem.
Our last amendment is item J. John, you want to kick us off with that?
Yes, this is an amendment to the A1 agricultural zone as relates to really setbacks of any kind of pasture area. This arose as a matter of a enforcement matter that the LDO and city attorney's office are working on a particular situation. I really have, I think, as you can see here, they're increasing the setback from 25 to 150 feet. I think there might have been some questions for one added section which excluded, let's see, where was that?
460.
Yeah, right here, the applicability that excludes existing, and I think that's because of state law compliance. You got to, basically, any existing established uses have to be grandfathered. So I'll turn it over to Phil if he has anything to add as far as relates to the enforcement and the reason for this zoning amendment.
All right, Phil, is your light on?
I believe it's
You're on all the time, aren't
I'm
you?
on all the time.
Well,
all right.
there we go.
As y'all will remember, this body adopted ordinance number 13227 in October of 2017. And at that point in time, changed pretty heavily some of the regulations regarding livestock and ownership of property and how quickly, how close animals could be to existing property lines. Before that time, there was a 20-acre requirement before anyone could have things that were agricultural or livestock in association with it. The ordinance that y'all adopted in 2017 opened that up to allow property, even by special permit of 1 acre, to be able to have an A1 zoning at that point. And it specifically limited the distance down to 25 feet of a barn that was existing at that point in time from existing property. There have been a lot of enforcement issues that have occurred over the years, and I brought Melinda with me this afternoon where she can tell you about some of those if you have any questions about them here. But because of that, the recommendation was made by our office to go back to the 150-foot distance restriction, at least for housing of animals from the adjacent property owners, because there have been a number of cases that have been going in city court back and forth that have really caused a lot of disruption among the neighbors. So that requirement is at least recommended in this version of the ordinance that's gone in front of the Planning Commission. I think it was approved without any question in that regard. We got some questions, I think, yesterday here, or maybe this morning, I don't know, about 38-460, which is the last provision regarding applicability. And that was dealing with the aspect of grandfathering, because you did create an ordinance in October of 2017 that allowed people to build things within the last 3 years to a certain standard. And the question at this point in time is, if you go back and change those standards, would you be taking property that people had actually built, at least barns or things closer than the limits in that regard? So the provisions of 460 specifically deal with the aspect if somebody has built something in that time frame in compliance with the ordinance, that they would be grandfathered in. We might suggest a few more changes specifically referencing ordinance number 13227 and the time frame of that period, just to limit that ability, because I don't think it's any property that is not in compliance, but it's only things that would have been constructed in compliance with the ordinance since it was adopted in 2017.
Phil, I see no lights. All right, here we go. Let me just jump in real quick and clarify something. So it was my understanding when we did this that animals would be kept 150 feet from R1 property lines. I think I can't speak for everyone, but that was my understanding when we originally did this, and we felt like that was a good protection. But then it came out that 25 feet, which if you're used to football is 8.3 yards. That's less than a first down. You can have 25 sheep doing their business 24 hours a day from your bedroom window. My understanding was that was not the case. So are we clarifying what our intent was through this ordinance? And I know that it's only applies going forward,
Right.
correct, Phil?
Yes.
It only applies going forward with new A1s, but I believe that was our intent, or
I
our
just need
thinking.
to check the video or minutes to confirm, just to kind of look, it's been a minute, I just need to, I'd be happy to check that to kind of confirm that if you
Okay,
need to.
'cause I feel like the conversation was, hey, 150 feet, which, if you use a football term, that's a 50 yards, 50-yard line, is where animals to the next R1. Now, going to the next A1, this has no application. I'm looking at you, John, and I'm talking to Phil. Sorry. It's a habit.
It's okay.
But if the next A1, that does not apply. So if there's an A1 and an A1, those rules do not apply. This is only to residential property lines to protect
That's
them.
my understanding, yes. It would only be for adjacent residential uses, not adjacent agricultural uses, which we are
Correct,
including.
okay. Going forward with new. I just want to make that.
I think and then there was a lot that was in this ordinance, there was a lot of complexity. I think where the 25 feet came from, if I had a barn that didn't, like let's say I had a barn that was strictly for my equipment, tractor equipment, you could put it within 25 feet. But the idea, like if you look at this section 48-453, you can see that it says any new building used for feeding livestock, because the idea is that's where you attract odors, things, or where you keep, anything that's keeping livestock should certainly be the 150 feet. And I think that might be where the difference between the 25 versus 150. Again, I need to go check the video record to confirm, but I think I recall if it's a barn strictly used for like, I got a tractor in it, but there's no livestock, that's one thing. But if I got a barn that's holding livestock and it's got feed in it, then it has a greater setback.
That's 150 feet. I think that's clear. I think what we're talking about now is the animals don't stay inside. The
Right.
animals roam and they
Sure.
congregate and they go out to the property fence line. They do their business all day.
Sure.
And they make lots of noise. I mean, it's just livestock. That's
Sure.
what happens. And I think that when we were talking about this, I believe that we were under the impression, or at least I was under the impression, that those animals would be kept 150 feet.
Gotcha.
And I believe we looked at a site plan that showed 150 feet of
Right.
pasture land or fence line. And now, I think where the problem is coming, that we've had some issues, we've had some bad issues with literally 8 yards away from people's bedrooms. And I just think that's unfair. So I appreciate you doing
Sure.
that. That's
We'd be
just my
happy to check
personal
into it.
opinion on that. I do have some lights, so Councilman Henderson.
So I think there's obviously another way to handle the A1 as opposed to amending it, and that is to just not approve it. If it is in an area that doesn't look like it's going to fit, or there's a lot of opposition to it, go back. I mean, I don't have a problem with the barn being 150 feet. Because we're talking about, sort of a spot location, but the fenced-in area, you got to have more than 300 feet across your property in order to even begin to have any pasture land. And it looks like to me, the fencing is going to defeat the purpose of having this ordinance in the first place. If we're going under the 20 acres, even the 5 acres, if it's a 5-acre lot that's deeper than it is wide, you're gonna have a 2-foot span of pasture land. It might run 100 feet long, but to me, it's it really defeats the whole purpose of having this new A1 zone. And like I said, there's another way to prevent a fence from being 150 feet or livestock from being 150 feet from the property line, and that's by not approving it. And we all have the ability to deny that up here. So to me, this almost makes this unusable by going to 150 feet from the property line with the fencing.
One other thought just to think about, and this is just an idea to chew on. If there were, I think what I hear Councilman Ledford talking to is relates to a residence. Something to think about is maybe it's 150 feet from any existing residence. Something to think about.
Now, you mean from the actual house itself?
So, or if you got, let's say, a property, because it's, correct me if I'm wrong, Phil, it's about coming to the nuisance.
Yes.
So if you're proposing on a relatively small lot to do an A1 use, and you're setting out your pasture area, if there is no structure next door, I think the option is, I think what I hear Councilman Ledford saying is if there's a structure next door, don't put that pasture fence right along the property line. It should be set back because there's a structure, residential structure that's there. So the idea is the 150-foot separation would come from the residence as opposed to the property line. That's something to think about.
Yes.
Okay, something to think about, and might be a friendly amendment to that, to this amendment, because I
Another
think
reason to punt, maybe.
the core of this is taking a look and protecting quality of life, and not maybe, maybe giving that consideration to people who were there first, and showing that we do care about them. And I think that might be a viable solution, is to change the language to 150 feet to the actual structure. Could also do some good, so we can definitely kick that around too. Very good. I have no other lights. John, I have no other comments from anyone. Oh, Dr. Burrs, do you want to hit your light? Thank you, ma'am.
Just a couple of things to think about.
Yes, ma'am.
150 feet from a structure, a residential structure, may be at the property line, which kind of kills the property if anyone wants to develop it
That's
next
true.
door.
That's a
I just
trade-off.
think about unintended consequences.
That's a trade-off, yep.
All right. If a property is grandparented in, and let's say there's a barn or whatever closer than 150 feet, it's frozen in that state. In other words, people can't add on to that barn.
Right, you cannot, well, it's an interesting question. Per state law, there's been, I know, some court cases about how much you can expand an existing legal non-conforming use.
Right.
Yes.
And I think all I'm saying is there's a lot of stuff here, and instead of diving in, if we could just think of unintended consequences, because those are the ones that are going to get us later on. So just a thought.
Thank you.
Oh, I think we have a response to that, so. Councilman Henderson?
Well, it's not really a response to that. I thought I heard this 150 feet has something to do with, Mr. Attorney, going to city court. Is that correct, or what?
Well, it has a lot of things. There have been movable structures. There have been different locations of storage of, barns or resting places for animals. I think that's been going on over a period of time. And there have been citations that are involved. If your code currently under 13227, the last revision to it actually does say that if you're allowing this for a fairly small lot of less than 5 acres, and it's a revocable permit. So in the event that there were violations of the code, for any municipal code violation, then the person's right to be able to have livestock in that location could be revoked by the council. But that would require council action in connection with it. Otherwise, you have a $50 fine violation in city court for each incident that occurs, to the extent that happens. And
Well-
Linda can tell you about what's been
Okay, so
occurring.
let me ask this question. Let's use the fence. By going to 150 feet, it's not gonna be retroactive, so everybody that's already got their fence 25 feet from the property line will maintain it, correct?
Yes, sir.
And how will that help us in court, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, it clearly would stop any additional structures being done that way and closer to the structures. I think the nuisance issue that the neighbors are complaining about is noise in the evenings here, animals fairly close, the aspect of flies, the aspect of rodents in connection with feed, storage, and all those things are addressed in the ordinance.
So we think 150 feet, you won't be able to hear a cow or horse or goat.
On a clear night, you may be, yes, sir.
Or smell them.
Might be able to smell them too.
Okay.
I've lived a
It
lot
is-
closer than that myself, yes, sir.
Yeah.
I would say, being clearly, getting back to Councilwoman Burge's comments about unintended consequences, it's probably to be careful about small sites, because it can
Well-
become a problem.
And here again, like I said, we have the ability to not approve
That's right.
the rezoning. And to me, that's the most effective way to handle this, as opposed to going back and trying to tweak and amend and make it almost unusable by doing this. But anyway.
Thank you, Councilman. I'll add one more comment to that. You know, this is not applicable to anything agricultural-wise. I think what we need to understand is that this is not taking away or referencing any area that you can plant, harvest produce. This is about large amounts of animals congregating near people's houses that are truly, we need to think about. And I think that's where the core of this is. And although I do appreciate that, that sentiment about this body, what if it's not this body? What if it's another body? I mean, we're leaving a lot up to decision-making on folks that may not be here in the future. And this, I think, would protect when it comes to the animal husbandry part of A1. And I think it's fair to people who live in the city to at least take a close look at this. Thank you. Councilman Gilbert, I see your light go on and off. You good? You sure? All right, I'm seeing nothing else, so if that's, John, thank you, good job. That was a little bit of a long one today. Oh, whoa.
One last line.
Steep
Almost
slopes and
forgot.
floodplains? Oh,
Yes.
so dear to my heart.
Yes, as I understand it, we won't, no, I was going to be sarcastic, I'm not going to do that.
Oh, come
It's
on,
too late.
throw it out
Yeah, It's
there.
too late, I won't do it. Sometimes I catch myself, that's a good thing. As I understand it, as you know, we're in the process of developing the report. We were originally planning on doing some community meetings to help clarify further the issues. And my understanding and talking to some of the council members is that you've kind of already had that public hearing process, and you've kind of heard from the community in terms of what the issues are. You're looking forward to getting the staff's report and recommendations, and maybe have a community meeting around that. So instead of having 2 rounds of public meetings, really have a meeting around the report recommendations to inform your thoughts. So I just wanted to be sure that's what I understand correctly, is that you would like us to not try to have this initial set of meetings until after we've completed the report, and then have some public meeting or meetings around that.
I think that was the general consensus of most of us who were in that. So I believe that is to be accurate, and unless I'm seeing any head shakes in no, I'd say, John, yes. That's what
Okay.
we like to do.
Thank you.
All right, thank you. All right, seeing no other lights, if anyone has any other business before this committee, if not, I will adjourn us till 6.